What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Why Nobody Plays series. And today we are going to be looking at one of the most powerful planeswalkers of all time, and I would say even to this day, probably at least in the top five most powerful planeswalkers ever printed. And for a time was the best one and was like the gold standard for what a planeswalker should do, and probably even erring on the busted side for the time. So, of course, before we get into the details of Jace the Mind Sculptor and kind of what happened and his impact on Magic as a whole, be sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell if you have not already. If you enjoy Modern and Pioneer content, that's going to be very beneficial to you because you will be notified as soon as those videos go live. And of course, there's a link in the description to the Discord server as well. You'll get notifications there as well when I go live on YouTube. So, Jace the Mind Sculptor. World Wake was released February 5th, 2010, and that is how we got introduced to this bad boy. So, real quick, Jace is a 4-mana planeswalker, 2 generic and 2 blue, for a 3 loyalty planeswalker with 4 loyalty abilities. With a +2 to look at the top card of target player's library, you can put that card to the bottom of that player's library. 0, draw 3, then put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in any order. -1, you return a target creature to its owner's hand, and a -12, you exile all cards from target player's library, then that player shuffles his or her hand into his or her library. So essentially, like from the top down, Jace is kind of meant to be like this control planeswalker. We see some other planeswalkers that kind of fit into that mold of being like in a control deck, but it, finds some niches like elsewhere. Jace is just straight up like you want to play this in a control deck, and for a long time, like he was kind of the gold standard for like a finisher that wasn't necessarily a finisher, but also just kind of propelled you into that late game stage where like you could kind of start to turn the corner and come to a conclusion of the game. So Jace, as you know, was one of the most popular cards in Standard at the time. Like it came out, and from really since its release, up until I would say maybe like early this year or even like parts of last year, Jace was like an $80 to $100 card at all times. Even after being like reprinted, it was still very high in price. For most of the time, like Blue White Control was a deck. It were really like Blue White X control decks were popular. They were actually viable for the modern, and this card just slot very nicely in there as 1 or 2 copies, so it's still warranted the price tag of being $80 to $100. And which is even crazier considering that Jace wasn't even legal in modern for really that long. At the inception of the modern format, Jace was banned, along with Stoneforge Mystic and some other cards, but Jace never got to see modern, or at least the beginning stages of the format. He was essentially relegated to Legacy after getting banned in Standard. And from there, we've seen Jace kind of thrive in that Legacy format, not recently, obviously, or else we really wouldn't be talking about him. He was, a good card in Legacy. Jace is probably one of the most powerful planeswalkers that you could play on an empty board, strictly for the fact that, just getting 2 brainstorm every turn, sculpt your hand, find answers to any sort of threats that you could possibly run into from your opponent, and then once you start +2ing your Jace, the game is virtually over. You're going to control your opponent's draw steps as basically as best you can for the rest of the game. The cards that you have able to cultivate through the numerous amounts of brainstorming is going to handle, whatever else that your opponent could draw that the Jace Plus is not going to be able to properly deal with. Being that your opponent has like a haymaker on top and then you end up bottoming it and then they have like another one, chances are you're going to be able to deal with it. And that's kind of where, Jace is so powerful, and there was like some mind games too that you could play with Jace the Mind Sculptor. Obviously with the +2, you could, your opponent could have a good card on top, and you just leave it on top, and they end up like cracking a fetch land to go search your land, and they're like, oh man, I had it. And there's like a way that you can kind of keep people on their toes, where you you made them guess, like, well, do I want to fetch? Do I not want to fetch? So when you did actually leave a bad card on top of their deck, there was times where they just would not, fetch their land. They would draw the card and, be severely disappointed as it's another land, and your Jace just slowly ticks up and ticks up. Virtually the only thing really stopping Jace from being just kind of a madman, if you will, is the fact that it starts at 3 loyalty. If you wanted to play this on turn 4 and then immediately brainstorm with it, there was the possibility that Jace could get hit with a lightning bolt. Of course, like of note, Jace for a lot of the time that it was in Legacy, and I believe, before it was unbanned in Modern, you had the Planeswalker redirection rule, which meant that damage that would be dealt to a player could be redirected to a Planeswalker. So, with Lightning Bolt being a prominent card, people could play in Legacy, where you'd see in like Grixis Delver strategies, and it really like any like blue-red strategies, burn, stuff like that. Jace conveniently having 3 loyalty means that if you decide to brainstorm on that turn, that you could potentially lose your Jace. So there was definitely some play with it where, you would play it +2 and get your opponent to exhaust a lot of resources, potentially like a combat step plus maybe like 1 or 2 cards to get your Jace off the table, and again for, like minimal returns. I mean, Jace at any point, at least back in that time, was a powerful Planeswalker to play. Playing it on turn 4, if you managed to keep the board clear, like it was going to put in a lot of work. But you were more likely to just plus it to keep its loyalty high, so that it wasn't going to die to whatever other burn spells or maybe like a hasty creature that your opponent could play. But later in the game, when you get to like turn 8, turn 9, turn 10, whatever, and you had like 8, 9, 10 lands in play, and you play a Jace, you're able to just brainstorm, put some bad cards on top of your deck, fetch them away, or, shuffle them with the numerous effects that Jace just got to play with as a benefit of being, created and printed in a time where fetch lands were introduced to standard through Zendikar block, and in Legacy where fetch lands are abundant, to get dual lands, and then you have like Stoneforge Mystics and things like that. That Jace getting to brainstorm and essentially getting to look at fresh cards even after a brainstorm with those numerous shuffle effects, just made Jace. I mean, brainstorm is like one of the best cards in Legacy, hands down. And Jace just getting to do that on a body every single turn while getting to be in the same format that Force of Will exists in. And with, the better of a player you are, the more impactful like your Force of Wills and things like that will end up being, your Dazes and so on, that Jace just kind of like was the glue that kind of held it together. It got to be the top end, it had the benefit of being able to be pitched the Force of Will, but then also being like a win condition that wasn't like Delver of Secrets or something like that. And just to kind of show how powerful it is, even in a format like Legacy where, you still see people lose the game on like turn 1 or turn 2 of the game, or, virtually lose the game at that point. Jace was still, $100 card. It was still very powerful. It, dominated, a lot of the formats that it was played in, and which is the reason why it was so much money for the time. And as we would kind of like go on and move through, like it would generally see like less and less play in Legacy as like the format got a little bit more efficient with some of its threats, but you would still find, people playing copies of Jace because, again, it is just so powerful, uncontested, and even like in the late game with, a bunch of lands in play, playing this and being able to hold up like counter magic, removal, and just kind of play protect the Jace until you are able to start plussing it to close out the game is just, cannot be more explained, I guess. It just, there's so hard to understand like when you have not played against this card, because even like nowadays for Modern, that now that it's legal, we don't see it at all. And I believe that to be the fact that it's a part of an archetype that doesn't really see much play in Modern. We see, these strictly like control decks where you play the minimum amount of win conditions and you essentially play a bunch of counters, you play a bunch of card advantage, you play, a bunch of removal. play Wraths and so on. Maybe you play a few Planeswalkers. You know, we're seeing cards like Teferi Hero Dominaria, we see Teferi Time Raveler, we see the Wandering Emperor, and so on. That Jace, even with, you know, its powerful abilities, like it's kind of its own way of being a way to forward your control game plan while also being a win condition of his own, just really isn't that good when we have cards like Unholy Heat that could just completely remove all the loyalty counters from a Jace even after a +2 on that turn. You know, one of the benefits of a Jace and getting to plus it immediately is the fact that, you know, cards like Lightning Bolt, which was like one of the best ways of kind of like dealing with Planeswalkers and stuff, because, you know, Abrupt Decay obviously doesn't deal with Jace. We didn't have cards like Assassin's Trophy. Really, and like one red mana like burn spells or whatever that would do that much damage to a player that you could redirect to Jace, which was a benefit to him for the fact that, again, you know, there's a lot of cards that, you know, if you wanted to deal a lot of damage, you had to spend a lot of mana, and in the archetypes and stuff that Jace wanted to play in, you know, you got punished for, you know, tapping out to do something, because then you got hit with like Mana Leak, or you got hit with Counterspell, you got hit with Force of Will, so on. So really understanding that, like, as the times kind of changed and we got more into, you know, these more lean and efficient cards, you know, we've gotten like way better creatures, the removal has gotten better, the rules have changed as well. You know, Jace, how old Jace is, he played at a time where you could play a Jace Bellerin, which is from like the original Lorwyn, and it would remove a Jace the Mind Sculptor. You know, like that's how the old Legend rule works, where obviously now you could have a Jace the Mind Sculptor, you could have a flipped Jace Vryn's Prodigy, you could have a Jace Bellerin, so on. Like, you just can only have one named copy of like a certain character and whatnot, you know, and it should be to a probably more of a benefit to Jace and, you know, obviously all these other legendary cards and permanents that exist now, that you can have essentially multiple copies of like the same character or the same legendary creature, permanent, so on, that they can kind of play off each other. And, you know, Jace, you know, Jaces could all work together and stuff like that, but, you know, we're not talking about all those bad Jaces. We're talking about probably the best Jace ever printed. Really, as we, you know, get into later sets where, you know, now we have rule changes where, you know, Planeswalkers can just become targets, and instead of, you know, target player or creature or specifically calling out Planeswalker, these cards just say like any target, which means that you could target a Planeswalker, and then cards that specifically target Planeswalkers will say so in their text box. And, you know, again, Unholy Heat being the biggest example, you have cards like Prismatic Ending, which a lot of the decks that do play it can easily remove a Jace. The One Ring, you know, puts in a lot of work, and just so, I mean, Orcish Bowmaster especially, I mean, not that like that card or the Lord of the Rings set stopped Jace from completely being played, but really that is kind of another knock against Jace, because it zeros, you draw 3 cards, you know, cool, you get your Brainstorm, but then you just lose your Jace to, you know, a Orcish Bowmaster, and then now they have a huge token to show for it as well to continue to pressure you after you tapped out for a Jace. You know, it's unfortunately, Jace has gotten to the point where, you know, his cost for what he does is just not good enough anymore. You know, we see 4-mana Planeswalkers and stuff like Karn the Great Creator that offers a lot in terms of deck building, where you get to get some of these silver bullets in your sideboard that could just essentially close the door completely on your opponent, or at least make it super hard for them to try to win the game, and then they have to find a ways to out your hate piece in their main deck, which they may only play like a few copies, where Jace, even with some of the upgrades to like the counter spells, the removals, the wraths, and so on, he really only fits in that one archetype, so he's not able to actually expand out into maybe a more mid-rangey blue deck, you know, something like Elementals, where it plays like a mid-range deck, but it can kind of like turn its heel and be aggressive. Like Jace the Mind Sculptor is strictly like a control Planeswalker. And while it's not necessarily a bad thing, unfortunately with power creep and the sheer efficiency of cards nowadays. Jace just can't hack it. And I mean, as one of the best planeswalkers for years, I mean, probably at least until like Oko was printed back in like 2020. For 10 years, this was like the gold standard for planeswalkers. Like, this was the end all be all. Like, everybody wanted to own one. I remember, a friend of mine, just absolutely loving Jace the Mind Sculptor and like wanting to own a copy of this card, but it being like $100, which even for the time, for a standard card, $100. Like, we saw that with like Jace Vryn's Prodigy, where it was like 70-80 bucks. Like, that's just insane, absolutely insane. Jace the Mind Sculptor, even now, is a very powerful planeswalker, and I think even if it was like printed in standard, he'd probably be a pretty good card to play in standard. Just unfortunately for Jace, it just can't compete in Legacy. It can't really compete in Modern anymore. Like, you could definitely try, and I still would argue that a Jace on an empty board, if Unholy he wasn't in the format, would still be a super hard card to deal with and could just eventually overwhelm your opponent just with the sheer card advantage and card selection that you end up getting. Put back bad cards in a matchup for hopefully good ones off of the brainstorms and things like that, and just getting to control your opponent's draw step at a certain point is going to be very powerful, because again, you're going to more than likely have enough answers to where even if your opponent has runs absolutely hot for multiple turns, it's not really going to matter. So unfortunately, that's why Jace ends up in this video. It gets to be a part of one of my just crazy rants where I bounce around all over the place, trying to tell you like why this card was so good for its time and where it was. And even now, like with the exception of like some of the other cards, like I feel like Jace is still a very good card. Just the conditions and stuff for the formats that he's legal in just aren't right for him right now. Could it change in the future? Possibly. We could get support for like Jace Planeswalkers, or just better cards like for control decks to play, where they can dip into playing more Planeswalkers, and then Jace can come back as like 1 or 2 copies of the deck, and so on. But until then, unfortunately, Jace will remain like one of those cards, almost a little bit like Liliana, where it will kind of maintain a semi-high-ish price tag for it, to essentially see like 0 competitive play in Modern or Legacy. Obviously not legal in Pioneer, so it just doesn't see a lot of play really anywhere, except for the maybe Commander, because all these abilities and stuff pretty good in Commander, as it turns out, in the format where you would think power creep would just kind of push everything non-efficient out. So it is what it is. Unfortunately for Jace, he ends up here. He gets to be part of my rambling discussion and all that. And yeah, sorry Jace, like, you're basically the Voldemort of Magic for 10 years, and then the boy who lived ended up being like Oko to kind of knock you off that pedestal. So yeah, that's going to do it for this video of Why Nobody Plays Jace the Mind Sculptor Edition. Of course, if you enjoyed this and you want to see more videos like this, leave a comment down below what cards that you'd want me to go over next. Hopefully in a little bit more structured manner, because I had something in mind that I wanted to do for Jace, and my brain got the best of me. I really like talking about Magic and like kind of how things shift and change, and I feel like Jace kind of emulates that, almost to perfection, where not only do cards that are necessarily weaker kind of get rotated out of these non-rotating formats by cards just being more efficient or being better at what basically what they do, but even powerful cards like this just sometimes don't end up seeing play. And while it's unfortunate, it's also a good thing to attempt to keep the game fresh while some of the other cards like kind of get to stay and have their time in the sun. So that's gonna do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like on the video, comment down below what card you would like to see next in the series. And of course, subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell, so you get notified when videos like this and others get posted. That's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.